I want to ask the question again, which has been with us from the beginning, and that's the question of how does the Divine Comedy do its work of signifying? How does it mean what it means? This is a question of allegory. And I've quoted that line from Singleton in the past: the fiction of the comedy is that the fiction is not a fiction. But I just read a very good essay by the Dantisto John Frischero, who said, who noted that, in fact, of course, every work of fiction works on that principle. Every fiction asks us to suspend our disbelief. So is Dante not really any different? I think we find as we descend lower into hell that the increasingly bizarre scenes, which I take it you all found as surprising as I still do, those bizarre scenes are matched with an increasing insistence on the part of Dante, the poet, or the narrator, to say, this really happened. He does that more and more the stranger and stranger the scenes get. So the question is, it can't be the case that he expects us to believe that lizards are melding with human forms, or that he saw St. Francis fighting over the body of Guido da Montefeltro. So what is it, or that's something that was told to him in hell? What's going on? What is Dante trying to do in this poem? And I would suggest that we should continue this thought throughout the rest of the work. I think that quote from Roland Barthes last time, that we're to be writerly partners in this poem, that we're supposed to join with the poet in creating this poem as a kind of joint effort. That is, we're not supposed to be passive consumers, we're supposed to be joint artificers here. So that would be very much against, for instance, taking Dante as providing a blueprint of hell. I think that's a total misreading of the work. I think it's exactly backwards, even though so much Western art since the writing of this poem has taken its cues from, of what the layout of hell is, has taken its cues from this poem. I think, in fact, the ossification of consciousness that would take Dante as somehow giving us a news report of something that he witnessed is exactly what he wants to overcome. If we think about works that have changed our lives, I would like you to have that in mind. What books have really changed the trajectory of your life? I would say that the Divine Comedy has a special place in that pantheon of books that have that kind of power. Obviously, Plato's Republic is one that has that kind of power. St. Augustine's Confessions do too. And now that work is very present here, even though Augustine himself is not a character. The whole rhythm of the Confessions is very present. It's one of the constant reference points for Dante, and that's something we should keep our ears open for. But I think that what Augustine does in that autobiography is something new, kind of in the history of the world, and that kind of shift to the existential is what we see Dante carrying on in this work. So we've talked about the difference between the allegory of the poets and the allegory of the theologians. I would want to make the distinction that, in fact, what Dante has done here, I believe, I'm working on this hypothesis, that he's theologized poetry. Christ is always there in very subtle ways. The Trinity is always there. The key to theological allegory is to understand that one event stands for another event, and that's the difference between theological allegory and poetic allegory, really. That the Exodus in the Old Testament is meant to stand for, say, Christ's passion and resurrection. And then that's supposed to be replayed in the individual Christian life, and then finally in the traversal to the new, the kingdom fully come. So that is the theological way of allegorizing, to recognize that every event in history somehow has a secret connection to other events, and tracing that. And the real key for a Christian autobiography and for what we have in the Commedia is that the events of the Commedia are there to show us our own existential condition and to put us on the table, as it were. And when we go through the dark night, the question becomes one of how do we respond? Because when our life is deconstructed, we can either we can respond in two ways. We can become cynical. We can become participants in the worldly game that is crushing us. We can become abusive, narcissistic, whatever. Or we can become skillful in compassion, to use kind of an Eastern way to formulate it. And I believe that that's what we've got in the Descent into Hell, is that despite the common reading, which Hollander does reflect, that the point is that the pilgrim is supposed to unlearn pity for the damned. I don't find that supported in the text at all, actually, the more I read it. And I find, in fact, that it's a matter of becoming skillful in compassion, being able to separate out what is noble in a sinner from what is ignoble, what is self-destructive and other-destructive. We don't allow quarter for those things that in fact do harm to the community and do harm to ourselves, but in fact we continue to recognize, as Dante the poet continues to show it, even as he descends, that there are in fact noble things even in the damned. And so I think that's a very tricky thing, but I think a very important thing for us to recognize. So I will now, just leaving those things on the table, put a few, do the overview of the rest of the poem so that we at least cover the narrative ground. We finished Canto 5 in the story Paolo and Francesca, and they're in the second circle of hell, that of the lustful. The pilgrim faints at the end of the story. He wakes up in the third circle, in which the gluttonous are punished. Canto 6 in each of the canticles is devoted to politics. Politics is all through, but those three you can compare, and we'll do so. But it's not an accident either that Canto 5 with Francesca comes up against this Canto 6, where Ciacco talks about Florence. One should always, this is a readerly tip, anytime there's an event that has your interest in the Commedia, look around, see what images are being used. Even if it doesn't seem to flow right into that scene, juxtaposition is almost always meaningful in Dante. So see what surrounds that action in front of you, the action, what surrounds the scene, the action around it, the images around it. Dante, the poet, is making choices about in order to amplify resonance. The connection between Francesca and the troubadour love poetry there and the Canto 6 on politics, one should note that Eros and politics are going to be always related in Dante's mind. That's part of how he's changing the troubadour tradition very fundamentally. One should look for that political angle. Gluttony is being punished in Canto 6, but the real issue has to do with how our appetites make common life impossible. So that's what Ciacco, who's there for gluttony, is going to talk about the factionalism that is tearing Florence apart, the factionalism between the whites and the blacks, the Guelphs that have split into two. And he says pride, envy, and avarice are the sparks that have set the hearts of all on fire. And there's those three that he's isolated there. The emphasis on the sins that tear apart the body politic continues in Canto 7, in which we experience the fourth circle and the punishment of the avaricious and the prodigal. The demonic guardian of that circle is Plutus. Here we see God versus Mammon, and that's alluded to with a reference to Michael the Archangel's war in heaven against Satan. And Plutus is strange and babbling kind of invocation of a Pope Satan. And that's going to introduce the emphasis of how greed has done so much to destroy and corrupt the clerical state. Indeed, the ranks of the avaricious are filled with clerics, including popes and cardinals. Dante, the pilgrim and Virgil proceed down to the next circle along a stream that originates with the river Acheron, which is at the top of hell. And from that circular stream, there's going to be a transverse streams that flow down, in this case to Styx, which is here figured as a swamp. This is the fifth circle. The river Styx itself is the circle. And in that, the angry and the sullen are punished. Virgil and the pilgrims see across the swamp the towers of the city of Dis, which marks off the nether regions of hell. And it's very important to note that it's a city. So this is the negative of the kingdom of God. This is the negative or the reality of Florence above earth. The wardens of that city signal Phlegios, the ferryman, across the river Styx, and that's how they get across that river. There's then a major confrontation at the walls of Dis, where Virgil expects that he can persuade the demons to open the gate, but in fact he fails, and it's one of the more dramatic scenes in the Commedia. Eventually, the Archangel Michael, it seems, dressed up as Mercury, it comes and just taps open the door at the gate, and that's how Virgil and the pilgrim go in. And they see a necropolis, that all these sarcophagi, these raised tombs, and that's what it is. When you enter into the city of sin, you enter the city of death. Here that heretics are punished, and we in particular see the heretics that denied that the soul outlives the body. In Canto 10, the travelers encounter Farinata, an important Ghibelline, and also with him in the same tomb is the father of Dante's best friend, Guido Cavalcanti. In Canto 11, we receive a lesson on the structure of hell. It is based on Aristotle's three main divisions: incontinence, which is the sins of the appetite, which are outside the walls of Dis. These are the lighter sins. Malice, which really can define everything inside the gate of Dis. And then a category that Aristotle calls mad bestiality. That's combined with Cicero's classification of inuria, injustice, injury, as force or fraud. So the two get mashed up together. It's not the cleanest division. It's not as clean at all as the mountain of purgatory, as we'll see, which is just simply the 7 deadly sins. Basically, force and fraud, which is what Cicero defines inuria as, they belong to malice, except that fraud itself gets divided into simple fraud and then fraud that's compounded because it's perpetrated against those that one has special obligations towards. That's treachery, and that's the lowest level of hell is the circle of the traitors. So above Dis, you've got the sins of the appetite. Below, inside the walls of Dis, you have sins of the higher faculties. The Christian anthropology of the medieval time has the appetites as faculties that get virtuously formed by temperance and fortitude. You've got the will that gets virtuously formed by justice, and then you have the intellect, which gets virtuously formed by prudence. Inside the walls of Dis, you've got an aiming for evil, malice, and that's the intellect and the will are bent towards doing harm. That's not what the incontinent are after. In Canto 12, the Virgil and the pilgrim clamber down to the 7th circle, the circle of the violent, which has 3 zones, according to whether one is directing violence towards neighbor. Those are punished in the river Phlegathon, which is like boiling blood. Violence towards self, which is punished in the wood of the suicides, and then violence towards God, those are punished in a desert, a waste of barren sand. They cross the desert in this very technically interesting way that Dante the poet devises along the same river that keeps descending down to the depths of hell. And they meet Dante's mentor, Brunetto Latini, and I hope we'll look at that scene in particular. They also meet noble Florentines. Supposedly these are guilty of the sin of sodomy, but it's a very, very favorable picture that is shown of these noble Florentines in Canto 16, who still care about the common good, which is shocking. The great break at the middle of the canticle, the middle of the whole work on the Inferno, is the flight of Geryon, which is it's a very strange scene. The end of Canto 16 says, "To a truth that bears the face of falsehood, a man should seal his lips if he is able, for it might shame him through no fault of his. But here I can't be silent." That's Dante the narrator saying. And by the strains of this comedy, so may they soon succeed in finding favor. I swear to you, reader, that I saw come swimming up through that dense and murky air a shape to cause amazement in the stoutest heart. again, this is one of those very stringent avowals that this is something that he's seeing. And so we have to understand, why is it that Dante is trying to make such a big deal out of his art? And it's partly to make us partners with him, to make the events of his life, which are being allegorized here, somehow grab hold of the events in our life to change us. This is also where usury gets treated, and the issue with usury really is that it's a way of cheating art. It's to make money produce money is one thing, but it's not productive, and we've seen a lot of financial problems because, in fact, that's true. Here he's concerned with usury, and the issue of Geryon is, how do you deal with the fact that art might be seen as something that's fraudulent? And that's anyway, that the case of Geryon, that monster that looks like a fair-seeming human but then has a body that is animal, circles them down slowly to the 8th circle, which is Malabolge, which is the evil pouches wherein are punished those who commit simple fraud. And it's a massive panoply, right? The seducers, flatterers, hypocrites, thieves, schismatics. The circle is extremely wide and sloping downward with 10 concentric circular valleys or trenches bridged over by a ridge, except for one place where that bridge is broken over the 6th bolgia. The action becomes wildly fantastic and farcical, even as the narrator's insistence on the literal truth of the narrative increases. Why is Dante the poet structuring things this way? I want us to keep that in mind. What is our impression? What is it we feel as we go deeper and deeper? We have the malebranche, those slapstick demons. We have mutations of lizards in human forms. Again, we have Francis fighting a demon over the soul of Guido. We have Bertrand de Born carrying his head by his hand like a lantern. Okay, we cross through, and that's the longest section, obviously, is the 8th circle. We get to the giants that are circling the final circle of hell. The giant Antaeus hands the travelers down to the final circle, which is Cocytus, a solidly frozen lake. It seems that it's 3 miles in diameter. This 9th and final circle contains those who have defrauded those to whom they were bound by special bonds. And there are 4 zones: Caina, named after Cain, for those who have betrayed relatives; Antenora, named after the one who betrayed the Trojans, and not in the Virgilian account, for those who have betrayed party or homeland; Ptolemaea, for those who have betrayed guests. That's a reference to a Maccabees incident; and Judeca, for those who have betrayed masters and benefactors. The action is no less outrageous. Indeed, in the penultimate zone, we are assured that those who betray guests die on the spot, and their bodies are thereafter animated by demons. I mean, it's clear that Dante is pushing it. He's got us looking at zombies here. Finally, it seems to me that the cold of Cocytus has frozen the pilgrim's soul. He acts dishonestly and most inhospitably in Ptolemaea. So it's a very raw scene. In the final canto, we have the demonic parody of the beatific vision. Behold this, Virgil says. There's a different kind of ineffability here, an inability to communicate what's going on, having to do with the loss of intelligibility rather than, as we'll see in heaven, that it's superabundance. Then Dante says, how faint and frozen I become, reader. Do not ask, for I do not write it, since any words would fail to be enough. I did not die, nor did I stay alive. Imagine, if you have the wit, what I became, deprived of both. 1,000 feet above the ice, Satan, the immobilized, frozen seraph, is chewing on Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. Virgil takes his pilgrim in hand, climbs down the hairy demon, turns around at the legs, and starts climbing upwards. They are climbing towards the other side of the world. So that's what happens. We see one of the things that we have to deal with, I think, with some precision, is the law of contrapasso, which gets explicitly put out in the case of Bertrand de Born, the one who is holding his head by his hand. That's the law of retribution, which is the law of eye for an eye, which for a Christian, once you get that equation in your head, you're going to realize that that's not what the new law of grace sticks to. So that's one of those questions about how Dante is questioning hell. We had some questions. We pretty much have covered the questions that I should have put on the table from last time, but the ones for this time, I'll just read out. How do the various punishments correlate to the sins being punished? That's the principle of contrapasso. Why does Dante insist on the literal truth of this Odyssey? What might it mean for us to take literally that Ulysses is present in hell, for instance? What dramatic function do the monsters fulfill? How does one react to the speeches of the noble sinners in these cantos? And how might the two capital sins not represented in hell's circles, pride and envy, relate to treachery? Finally, how does the ninth circle show us the anti-image of love?